It rarely announces itself all at once. It creeps in quietly. One morning you wake up, unlock your phone, and see someone your own age sharing something huge. A promotion, an engagement, a first house, some milestone that feels grown up and finished. You scroll past it, then the next post, then another, and all of a sudden there's a tightness in your chest you can't quite name. It isn't really envy. It feels more like lateness, like you took a wrong turn somewhere, like everybody else got handed a map while you're still figuring out which way you're even facing. This is the sensation of believing your life is running behind schedule. Not collapsing, not broken, simply late. And the hardest part is that nobody else can spot it from the outside. You keep showing up. You still laugh on cue. You still tell people you're working on things, yet underneath there's a quiet panic humming away, repeating the same question on a loop. What's actually wrong with me? Psychology does have a name for this feeling, but the label rarely captures how crushing it actually feels. Because this isn't simple comparison. It isn't just shaky self-esteem. It's a deep internal sense that time is speeding along for everyone else while it crawls for you. People who feel they've fallen behind tend to carry an invisible clock inside their heads. Not a literal one, a social one. A clock built from expectations, milestones, and deadlines nobody ever spoke aloud. By this age, you're supposed to have arrived here. By that age, you're supposed to already possess that. And when your actual life doesn't line up with the schedule, your mind doesn't react with curiosity, it reacts with verdicts. What most people never realize is that this feeling almost never grows out of genuine failure. It grows out of timelines absorbed unconsciously, inherited from family, from culture, from social media, from the stories we grew up consuming. By adulthood, these timelines feel less like opinions and more like established fact. And once that belief takes root, your brain starts filtering everything you see through it. You stop noticing where you stand and start noticing where you don't. You stop tracking progress and start tracking the gap, the distance between where you are and where you assume you should be. Psychologically, this produces something researchers call temporal self-discrepancy. That's an academic phrase for a very ordinary ache. The person you are right now feels miserably out of step with the person you assumed you'd have become by this point. And every single day, that gap seems to stretch wider, heavier, harder to look away from. People stuck in this state often describe their life as frozen, even while they're technically in motion, learning, working, surviving, growing in small, quiet ways. None of it feels like it counts, because it doesn't resemble the imagined version of success they keep measuring themselves against. And here's the cruel twist. The more behind you feel, the harder it becomes to actually move forward. Because feeling behind isn't only an emotional wound, it reshapes how your brain operates. Once the mind believes it's failing some invisible schedule, it slips into a constant state of low-grade threat. Not terror, not fear you could point to and name, just a persistent hum of pressure sitting in the background. That pressure narrows your focus. It dulls creativity. It makes ordinary decisions feel far heavier than they should. Suddenly everything feels risky. Trying something new feels dangerous because what if it just proves you're already too late? Committing to a direction feels terrifying because what if it's the wrong one and burns even more time? Rest feels unearned because you haven't done enough yet to deserve it. So people freeze, not out of laziness, not from lack of ambition, but because their nervous system is drowning under the belief that the clock is running out. This is why so many people who feel behind also feel utterly drained. Even when their actual daily life doesn't look demanding from the outside, they're constantly rehearsing alternate versions of their own existence, lives where they started sooner, chose more wisely, figured things out earlier, spoke up, took the leap, never squandered time. The brain doesn't file these thoughts under imagination, it files them under loss. And grief, even imagined grief, weighs heavily. There's another psychological layer that rarely gets discussed. Feeling behind often travels with a quiet undercurrent of shame. Not the loud kind, the subtle kind, the sort that whispers rather than shouts. The kind that makes you dodge questions like, "So what have you been up to lately?" The kind that makes you shrink your own accomplishments because you assume they won't sound impressive enough. This shame doesn't originate in reality. It originates in an identity built on comparison. When your sense of worth gets tangled up with your progress relative to other people, your identity becomes fragile. Instead of asking, "Am I growing?" you start asking, "Am I growing fast enough compared to them?" And comparison is a race with no finish line. Research in psychology points out that human beings weren't built to size themselves up against hundreds or thousands of peers at once. For nearly all of human history, Comparison happened inside small circles, a village, an extended family, a handful of people. Today, your brain is stacking your private, messy, unfinished life against everyone else's polished highlight reel. Your mind can't tell the difference. It reads constant upward comparison as proof that you're inferior. That's why feeling behind so often comes bundled with a distorted self-image. People begin viewing themselves as inherently slower, less capable, somehow fundamentally flawed. They start rewriting their own story to explain why they haven't made it yet. I must just lack discipline. I'm simply bad at life. Everybody else cracked the code except me. But none of that is insight. Those are conclusions drawn from incomplete evidence. What almost nobody acknowledges is that feeling behind is frequently a sign of delayed alignment, not delayed ability. Plenty of people move slowly, not because they lack potential, but because they're trying to construct a life that genuinely fits who they are. And fit takes time, especially in a culture that rewards speed over depth. People who feel behind tend to be more reflective. They interrogate the paths in front of them instead of walking them blindly. They think things through before committing. They hesitate not from incapacity, but because they're trying to avoid building a life they'll eventually need to flee. But reflection doesn't photograph well on a timeline. There's no post for inner clarity, no applause for declining to rush, no celebration for outgrowing dreams that were never really yours. So from the outside, it resembles standing still. From the inside, it's often quiet rebuilding. Another overlooked factor is emotional backlog. Many people who feel behind spent earlier chapters of life simply surviving rather than building. They were navigating emotional strain, family pressure, instability, self-doubt, environments that never nurtured growth. While others were racking up achievements, they were learning how to keep their heads above water. Psychologically, survival mode postpones development. When your nervous system is locked on safety, long-term planning gets shoved to the back seat. That's not a personal failing. It's a biological response. But later, once life finally calms down, the comparisons begin. You're safe now, the world seems to say. So why aren't you further along? Because safety arrived late and healing takes its own time. People who feel behind routinely underestimate how much invisible work they've already put in. Emotional maturity, self-awareness, resilience, empathy. None of these show up as visible milestones. Yet they shape the direction of a life far more than any early achievement does. Still, the mind doesn't reward progress it can't see. It keeps demanding proof. And that's where the inner tension builds. You feel pressure to catch up, yet you don't even know anymore what catching up would mean. Catch up to what exactly? To whom? To which version of success? That confusion can trigger impulsive decisions, abrupt career changes, rushed relationships, commitments made from fear rather than genuine alignment. Psychologically, this gets labeled urgency-driven behavior. It's action powered by anxiety, not clarity. And it rarely leads anywhere peaceful. People who feel behind are constantly told to stop comparing themselves or to go at their own pace. Those phrases sound soothing, but they never actually touch the real problem. Because the issue was never comparison itself. The issue is identity fused with speed. Once speed becomes your measuring stick for worth, slowing down starts to feel like vanishing. So the real work isn't ignoring other people. It's disentangling your value from your velocity. That requires a psychological shift that doesn't happen overnight. It begins with recognizing that life was never a single straight track. It's a web of different paths that cross, pause, loop back, and start again. Some people sprint out of the gate and slow down later. Others wander for years before finding momentum. Some bloom quietly and then suddenly rapidly. The brain craves a straight line. Life almost never hands you one. And here's something crucial that most people never hear said out loud. Feeling behind does not mean your chance has passed. It means you've arrived at a point where deliberate choice matters more than raw momentum. People who race ahead early are often just following pre-written scripts. People who feel behind are frequently forced to write their own. That path is harder, lonelier, but ultimately far more honest. The discomfort you're carrying isn't evidence of inadequacy. It's the friction of becoming aware. Awareness always shows up before change does. And awareness is rarely comfortable. As adulthood settles in deeper, the sensation of falling behind stops being abstract. It gets personal. It starts attaching itself to ordinary moments. Birthdays feel weightier. Conversations feel loaded. Simple questions carry a heaviness they never used to have. So where are you at in life? It sounds innocent enough, but to someone who already feels behind, it lands like an audit. Their mind doesn't respond with facts. It responds with judgment. It scans through everything still undone. Everything they assumed would already be true by this point. Psychologically, this is exactly where time pressure morphs into identity pressure. Especially through your 20s and 30s, society quietly rewrites the rules. Exploring is no longer celebrated the way it once was. Uncertainty starts to look suspicious. You're expected to be settled, or at minimum clearly heading somewhere. When that doesn't happen, people don't always call it out directly. They simply stop asking the follow-up questions. And silence can land louder than criticism ever could. That's why so many people who feel behind start pulling back socially, even the ones who are naturally warm and thoughtful by nature. They don't want to explain their situation. They don't want to compress complexity into something that sounds acceptable in a sentence. They don't want to be seen as unfinished, so they keep pieces of themselves hidden. Over time, this creates a quiet fracture inside. There's the inner self, still searching, still becoming, still unsure, and the outer self, working hard to look calm, capable, and fine. Holding that split together burns energy, emotional and mental both. That's why burnout so often shows up in people who don't appear overwhelmed on the surface. They're not exhausted by their workload alone. They're exhausted from constant self-monitoring, from perpetually editing their own narrative, from carrying the fear that if they ever slow down or stop performing stability, they'll be exposed. Another pattern that surfaces here is delayed permission. People who feel behind tend to postpone joy until they've caught up. They tell themselves they'll relax once things stabilize, that they'll feel happy once they've succeeded, that they'll feel confident once they've proven themselves. But the finish line keeps sliding further away. That builds a life spent entirely in preparation mode, forever almost ready, forever one step from actually beginning to live. Psychologically, that's a dangerous habit because it trains the brain to tie self-worth to future outcomes instead of present reality. You don't feel entitled to enjoy where you currently stand. You don't feel entitled to celebrate the small wins. You don't feel entitled to rest. And without rest, perspective narrows. One of the most misread parts of feeling behind is how it warps motivation. From outside, it can resemble a lack of drive. But internally, it's often the reverse. There's simply too much weight riding on every single choice. When every decision feels like it has to repair your whole life, nothing feels light enough to actually start. So people stall. They put things off. They distract themselves. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels overwhelming. Every decision seems to carry the burden of lost time, and the fear of choosing incorrectly becomes paralyzing. This is where self-trust starts to erode. If you believe you're behind because of past bad choices, it becomes that much harder to trust the choices you're making now. You second-guess yourself endlessly. You go hunting for reassurance. You compare yourself all over again. You stall out. Psychology shows that confidence isn't built by getting everything right the first time. It's built by watching yourself recover from the choices that didn't work out. But people who feel behind rarely extend themselves that grace. They treat every decision as though there's zero margin for error left, as if one misstep will confirm every fear they've ever held about themselves. That mindset slowly shrinks a life down. Relationships tend to grow complicated too. When you feel behind, you can end up out of step with friends hitting the traditional milestones on schedule. Even without resentment, there's a distance that creeps in. Conversations circle around experiences you can't fully connect with yet, or maybe don't even want, but feel obligated to want anyway. So you listen, you nod, you support, and later you head home feeling oddly hollow. Some people respond by rushing headlong into relationships or commitments just to feel synced up again. Others withdraw completely. Neither extreme brings any real peace because the actual root issue was never timing. It's self-acceptance. Feeling behind frequently masks a deeper belief. I'll only be acceptable once I arrive. But arrival is a mirage. There's no permanent state where life suddenly feels complete and secure. Even people who appear to be ahead are quietly wrestling with their own uncertainty, fear, and doubt. They just have a different set of reference points. Research on life satisfaction reveals something interesting. Happiness doesn't reliably rise alongside early achievement. In plenty of cases, people who follow winding nonlinear paths report deeper fulfillment later on, once their effort finally catches up with alignment. But society rarely tells those particular stories because slow growth isn't dramatic. Delayed blooming doesn't go viral. Quiet resilience doesn't photograph well. So the mind fills the silence with assumptions. Another key psychological truth is that feeling behind often intensifies when identity itself is still underdeveloped. When you don't yet have a clear grasp of what actually matters to you, It becomes easy to borrow someone else's definition of success. And borrowed definitions almost never fit properly. That creates a constant sense of mismatch. You chase goals that don't excite you, and then feel broken when those goals fail to motivate you. You assume the flaw is in you, not in the goal itself. But motivation isn't a measure of moral character. It's a signal. People who feel behind frequently ignore that signal because they're busy trying to outrun shame rather than listen to genuine curiosity. They're driven by the fear of being left behind, not by real interest in where they're headed. That kind of motivation burns hot and fast and leaves emptiness in its wake. So what actually helps? Not affirmations, not pretending you're further along than you are, not forcing optimism. What helps is a slow psychological reframing of time itself. Instead of asking, how far behind am I, the better question becomes, what season am I actually in right now? Some seasons exist for building, some for unlearning, some for healing, some for experimenting. Trying to harvest during a season meant for planting only breeds frustration. When people finally let themselves view their life as cyclical rather than linear, something inside relaxes. The urgency loosens its grip. Choices grow lighter. Movement becomes possible again. Another crucial shift is separating pace from purpose. You can move slowly and still be deeply aligned. You can move fast and still be completely lost. Purpose was never proven by speed. It's revealed through consistency over time. People who feel behind consistently underestimate how powerful small, sustained actions become once they're rooted in steadiness rather than panic. This doesn't mean ignoring reality or dodging responsibility. It means choosing progress that respects your nervous system instead of overwhelming it. Even from a purely psychological standpoint, the brain responds better to manageable steps than to dramatic overhauls. Safety comes before growth. Clarity comes before commitment. And one of the most healing realizations of all is this. You are not behind life. You are in dialogue with it. Your timeline reflects your own questions, your own values, your own circumstances, and your own inner work. It's telling a story that can't be rushed without losing its meaning. The feeling of being behind usually fades not because life suddenly speeds up, but because self-compassion finally catches up with self-awareness. Fades when you stop asking, why am I not there yet? And start asking, what am I learning right here? Because learning never shows up on a resume, but it shapes every chapter that follows. Eventually, plenty of people who once felt behind look back and recognize something quietly powerful. The delay gave them depth. The uncertainty taught them discernment. The slower pace forced them to face themselves instead of hiding inside momentum. They didn't miss out on life. They met it more honestly. And while that recognition doesn't erase the regret, it does transform it. Regret turns into information instead of punishment. The past becomes a teacher instead of a judge. If you feel behind right now, it doesn't mean life has passed you by. It means you're standing at a threshold, a point where living on autopilot no longer works, where borrowed timelines no longer satisfy, where your own inner voice is asking for something real. That moment is uncomfortable, but it's also meaningful, because so many people never stop long enough to question the path they're on. They just keep running and wake up later wondering why they still feel hollow despite being right on schedule. You are questioning things now, and that matters, not because it makes you special, but because it makes whatever comes next intentional. Being behind was never a permanent identity. It's a temporary vantage point, one that often shows up right before clarity, alignment, and a different kind of forward motion begin. Not louder, not faster, just truer. And sometimes that changes everything.